Eduardo Carrillo was open to many, many different points of view because he was not just an artist, but he was a professor, an intellectual. I think the thing about Eduardo that I can relate to in many ways as a scholar and an artist is how difficult it was in our generation of Chicanos to take on multiple roles. So to be both, and then on top of that, to be an organizer as he was, or doing cultural work, expanded it even further. And those to me are like the dualities of Chicano art, that we never quite forget our mythology or our Mesoamerican or indigenous spirituality. And at the same time, we value highly our everyday life, because our everyday life is where we learn about struggle. And it's what keeps us grounded in some way. It's hard when a person has left us and we can't ask them anymore, what did that painting mean? All we can do is look at their history, look at their past, look at the things they did, and try to surmise. And some of his paintings are not easy to read, because they're filled with this everyday vernacular, laborer, landscapes, and then a mythology. And sometimes the mythology is just the play of light and dark, luminosity.
He was Ed, or Edward, and then it was Carrillo. 2 R's, 2 L's, and an O.
One of the things about Ed that I gotta say, he never did anything but beautifully painted paintings. Right from the beginning, it was sort of like he just had a natural touch.
Ed was a very universal person. He was a guy that just embraced everybody. And that was the beauty of Ed.
When I met Eduardo Carrillo, my professor, he was a great inspiration as a person, an artist, a man.
He was so humble and quiet a lot. He did not reveal to me even that he was a painter for a while. People wouldn't know until somehow they discovered. Since he was a person who didn't promote himself and his life wasn't finished, I started to see myself as a useful person in that picture. I went, what can I do? Carrillo, Museo Carrillo, has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?
My brother was an artist. My father was a commercial artist, so there was an influence there. In college, right away, I decided that, or thought I, was best suited to go into art, so I did immediately, and got involved in painting probably when I was a sophomore.
One day at UCLA, I went into the basement of the old art department, and there was this barrel-chested man, and he was standing in front of this very large canvas, brushes clenched in one hand and kind of a paint palette, and he was making these moves on this canvas, and it was kind of a dance. He was putting on very carefully sometimes, and other times getting it down. But I was stunned, and I knew that I would be there almost every day to watch this.
In early college or UCLA, I really felt like at home there for the first time because there were people that were interested in what I was doing and I was interested in what they were doing. Like Louis Luneta and Roberto Chavez, Charles Garabedian, my brother-in-law Lance Richburg. These were my heroes at the time.
I probably met him before Lance did. I
Chaz
met him
did.
when he was just a freshman at UCLA. Anybody that met him wanted to be around him. It was amazing.
I was aware of Ed at a distance to begin with, and then when Ed returned from Spain, then that was then I got to know Ed. And I always wanted to know Ed because, he was really quite a glamorous character, at least in my eye. He was a beautiful guy, he had this mustache like Emiliano Zapata, who was a hero of mine because I love the movie.
One of the things I remembered is that we both smoked pipes. One day he came by my studio and he said, I made this pipe rack for you. And I said, thanks, Ed. He said, well, I was making one for myself and I thought not much trouble to make another one. And I thought that was a pretty good reason.
My whole interest in learning about my culture, Mexican culture, came about in like 1966. I had some roots in La Paz, Baja California, where my father lived, where my father was born. We went there, my family, and we started the Centro de Arte Regional, which was a center for regional arts and crafts.
Our idea was, we could be artists if we were also teachers. And I think that he got this idea that here was an opportunity to do these things where, one, he could employ these young, untutored and unemployable kids. They would get a salary for learning how to throw pots, and then they would throw pots, and then Ed would teach them about decorating the ceramics.
As far as a craft center, I thought it would be a viable thing to learn and to set up in La Paz. The Centro was in a almacén, or a warehouse that the government had given us.
He became a ceramicist. He learned about clay, he learned how to throw pots, all sort of on his own. He just wanted to do these things, and he had an incredible strength and will to do things, to accomplish things.
That was the idea that he had gotten, as I remember it, a ceramicist and a weaver, and he was teaching painting, and they were going to do this for, I think, 5 years, and then they were going to leave, and the older boys would then become instructors to a younger generation.
They would go out and find the clay, dig the clay, find the minerals to make the glaze. Everything was there. And Ed had taught himself all this, as Chaz mentioned. Before this, Ed had had nothing to do in his career as an artist. Had had no training, had nothing to do with ceramics, had shown no interest in crafts before. But he did this because he thought he could institute this school that could help these kids and as well establish a tradition of crafts in this part of Mexico where there was no crafts tradition, and which was his family's part of Mexico.
So I think that Eduardo Carrillo's sustaining of his roots in San Ignacio and La Paz, it gave him a special kind of insight. His figurative work is very much focused on laborers, people who work, ride the horses, pull the fishing nets. Somehow they're physical and they have a job to do, but there is almost a paradise quality to it.
Grandmother and Ed got along beautifully. She was a great influence in his life, I think. And he did go to San Ignacio to visit, and he liked it.
Ed's ancestral home was in San Ignacio, which is this beautiful village right dead in the center of Baja. It's like the classic image of the oasis, because it's this palm grove in the middle of this brown desert rock, beautiful desert, but rocky desert, no green. All of a sudden you see like this emerald jewel. And you go down into the village of San Ignacio, this really old kind of colonial village with this stream that runs to the village and through everyone's yard, and everyone has access to it as the source of water. All these date palms growing there, and Ed's mother and grandmother living there in the old home place.
I really love the landscape works that Eduardo Carrillo did, because I think they are some of his most classic moments of spirituality. He makes these landscapes that look as though what is missing is the myth, and the myth could land at any moment in those paintings.
My first real experience in doing architectural type painting was back in about 1964, when my mother had asked me to do some paintings in the little church of the town where she was brought up in Mexico. This was in San Ignacio, Baja California. There was a church there that was built in 1710. The paintings that were up in the pendentives of the cupola then had been rotted away, and there was actually a bat living behind one of the paintings. Basically, they're not original type paintings. I looked at El Greco's work a great deal, so what I had done was a takeoff on El Greco's Four Evangelists. President Echeverria stopped in San Ignacio, and apparently they thought that the paintings, when they looked at them, were original El Grecos and placed there a long time ago. And so he ordered then the people of the town to remove the paintings, or at least one painting, which they did, and they sent it to Mexico City to see if it was a real El Greco.
Then came the murals. Now, this is still at UCLA. There was this quite fabulous mural that he did.
Ramses Noriega, who was a painter and a leader of Chicano students' activities at UCLA, asked me to participate with him in a mural project along with two other artists. We did work on the mural, Chicano history.
Well, the late 1960s was a time of anti-war awareness and organization across the United States, including in the Mexican-American community, where so many of our young people were being drafted and killed in a higher proportion to our representation in the population.
But in that didactic, historic period of the late 60s, early 70s, when so much of what was important about muralism was the messaging, they were much more than just big portraits. They were pictures that were hearkening to a narrative, and the messaging was, pride and culture and identity.
Where did the concept of mural come? Of course, by natural heritage, the Latin heritage to surround the church or surround the plaza with purposefulness.
And that was exactly what the Los Tres had been doing in Mexico when they went and they painted all those murals. They were painting for a fundamentally illiterate populace, people who did not read and write, who did not know their history. And so they painted it for them.
Since there were four artists, there were four separate aspects to the painting. Since I had just come back from Mexico and been living in the desert, a lot of what I wanted to express was the spiritual aspect that I had uncovered in Mexico, the Indian heritage, the union of the Indio with spirit of nature.
The Mecha mural that he and Ramses Noriega and Salsalache and Sergio Hernandez do is really sort of a precursor, a prophecy for what will happen at the moratorium. Unlike many other murals that were painted in that era, really were about a moment of resistance.
About a month after, or actually 2 weeks, I believe it was, after the painting was finished, there was an event called the Chicano Moratorium. And it seems like a lot of what went on at the moratorium was actually mirrored in this imagery of the painting we had just finished. This, in a sense, kind of changed my ideas as to what I was and what was happening in the whole social movement, or the civil rights movement, which I think this Chicano movement really has grown out of.
When he was there in Santa Cruz, he did one of the most wonderful murals.
We could sense it, I think, in the way he painted, that he would undertake these huge project paintings that were extremely difficult.
One of the first malls ever, and all these little shops inside and so forth. The mall had this entryway where nothing happened, sort of like just this box-like hall that you kind of come in, entering one part of this mall. And so the people who ran the shops employed Ed. Basically, they just provided the materials. If he would take this entry and do a mural.
It was like 44 feet long, 18 feet high, and 8 feet wide. The theme of the mural then deals with the birth of the corn god, who is represented on the ceiling of the painting. And then you see the image coming out of the clouds. On the back wall is an image of the crucifixion, where you see the corn god crucified.
So there was a lot of attraction to the mural. There were a lot of people drawn to it. Oftentimes there would be a musician in there playing their music. There would be their horns, flutes. I remember people playing flute, but beautiful music in there. And so in the evenings, vagrants, sometimes people who had been drinking, maybe homeless people would wind up in that space.
I was discussing in my class of painting how you should work with materials that are going to last. A student raised his hand and said, do you know that they painted out your mural downtown? I didn't know. So I had to go down and see it. Which was a big shock for me, and
in fact, maybe that was one of the problems with the mural that got washed in UC Santa Cruz, is that it was ahead of its time. You could probably put that mural up now and it would be fine. Images of the calaveras and that would be okay. It wasn't then.
When I was getting to know Ed, he took me down to the Palomar Arcade and showed me where the mural had been. We were able to peek through the crack in the door. He didn't say it broke his heart, but I think it broke his heart.
Eduardo understood the meaning of scale for muralists, which is the relationship of the size of the figures painted on the wall to their audience. Not only do the arms come out and embrace you, they're also kind of welcoming you to the whole space. And so one wall speaks to the other wall. The ceiling paintings speak to the two walls. It's a whole womb-like environment that envelops you when you're in the space. And I must say that being in the space when it was painted was a bit of a spiritual experience all by itself.
Las Tropicanas is one of Eduardo Carrillo's most profound paintings because it offers us a variety of insights into what we call iconography, or the meaning of the painting. At first glance, you don't notice the amphora in the bottom. You don't notice that there is some kind of furry beast at the very top of the overpass, and you see his teeth and you think, is that a jaguar? At the same time, there is a building behind the overpass that looks like an Aztec temple or a skyscraper. And then there's this psychedelic quality to the color, to the figures. You could write a whole essay on just Las Tropicanas. What I find so fascinating about Eduardo Carrillo's painting of Sor Juana is the physicality of it. Sor Juana was known for her beauty, but more than anything, she was known for her intellect. But what I found so important about Eduardo Carrillo's interpretation of her is the agony and ecstasy of her body. You know, it's writhing, it's in full physical reality in a way that almost no one has ever painted her. In the work that Eduardo Carrillo did called Reaching for Coatlicue, in my interpretation, he is basically himself a figure in the painting, and he is reaching for a female figure wrapped in a snake, and I see it as a reference to Coatlicue's skirt made of snakes. Now, Coatlicue was a triple goddess. She was a goddess of birth, of death, and of maintenance. Coatlicue is probably the mother figure of all mother figures for Chicanos. It almost feels like the painting is spinning and he's floating away from her and he's reaching to grab her. That somehow he's looking for that Mother Earth.
For the ceramic mural that's on Olivera Street, he experimented to make ceramic tile. It was like multiple tiles into this mural representing Hidalgo at night with these people holding torches. It's a very strange and exotic work.
This mural had to be done in tile because they wanted something that would last for a long time. The image that goes on the tile is of Father Hidalgo and a group of his compatriots that are mustering in front of the Church of Dolores, where Father Hidalgo gave the grito, the famous grito de independencia. He gave it on the night of the 15th of September, 1810. Though Father Hidalgo wasn't successful in his insurgency, he is always remembered as the father of Mexican independence.
Eduardo Carrillo was creating a mural about the founding of Mexican identity for the Grito de Dolores. He was creating imagery that was utterly reflective of Mexican influence and yet stylistically indelibly American and contemporary and even Californian.
Not only the destiny of Eduardo Carrillo, but the beginning of Olivera Street. The Carrillo work must be maintained and sustained. Otherwise, everything is meaningless. We must take care of the great Mexican murals.
This property was I think it was my great-grandmother's, went to my grandmother. And when my grandmother passed away when I was, I think, in the 5th grade, and then it went to my father. So it wasn't until then that he started to work on it.
Tio Beto was working here all the time. Like, that's what he did. That was his 40 hours a week, probably more. He'd just come up here and work. So he made the walls, he made gardens, watered every day, raked, is impeccable.
Kind of our family for the town of San Ignacio, to my recollection, my grandmother was moved to the United States, to Los Angeles, and then she would bring truckloads of stuff down to San Ignacio. So she was kind of like the connection between San Ignacio and the United States, and they'd load up dishwashers and all kinds of things and bring it down and give it to the people in the town.
The peace of it when Eduardo would be here painting so quietly at the table, and the children would come around so quietly and respectfully, they would watch. There were other citizens of the town who would come up too. And everybody respected what he was doing. They really appreciated the painting. So he would paint them. He painted everybody who would sit down and be modeled. I brought Chacho 2 copies of La Última Cena, which is a painting Ed did for Chacho. Chacho asked him to do a Last Supper. So he thought about it and he decided yes, he would do it. Chacho was clear that he wanted his son Rogelio to be Jesus in the middle, but everybody else could be whoever they were. Models, that was the big issue. Where was he going to get 13 different models? All the men who came up the hill were older, they were seasoned, and they all were clear they did not want to be Judas. So that was a problem. Where was Judas going to sit and who was going to model for Judas? One day, Jacobo brought up a man from El Salvador. He was visitor to the town. He wasn't invested here, and so he was the designated Judas. If Ed were talking to you, everything that would be said would be different than what I'm saying, because he always had very surprising, unexpected things to say about whatever he was talking about. It was always surprising. When he died, I went, oh no, I can't believe it. I'm going to live without that surprise? This is what he said as he was dying. He said, the most important thing is to help people.
He was an explorer. He explored places, potencies, color. He pushed everything. He took everything in and pushed everything out. That was his currency with himself. There are paintings that I think are, I have to use the word masterpiece. There are masterpieces, intellectually, emotionally, and in his capacity as a journeyman in the process of painting.
I've thought a lot about the legacy of Eduardo Carrillo. I've thought about, is his legacy as an artist separate from his legacy as a scholar and organizer? And then I go back to his life and I think about, his almost classic transformation in that cultural reclamation journey that he made. So in some respects, I think that early politicization drove him for all the rest of his life to be a teacher, to create learning for others, to make Chicano and Mexicano history a part of everybody's understanding. And so his legacy is in his individual work, but I think even more so in his dedication to learning. And in between, he has to withstand the same things we all did, the denigration of your values and your vision, your artwork being whitewashed, You fight and struggle through all of it so that the thing you stand for, which is bigger than who you are, the thing you stand for will live on. And I think that is his legacy.
When I got to UC Santa Cruz, Ed started going through his class and saying, here's the list of materials you need. What the hell's a number 6 brush? Became my favorite brush later on. How do you use a palette? I mean, watercolor paper, how do you buy it? And then I didn't have any money. After class, I told Ed that. And he looks at me and he just goes, come with me. Takes me downtown. We go to the art store and goes, come on. He gets a box, a carrier, starts putting stuff in, naming it as he goes. This is palette knife, this is number 6, this is watercolor, these are acrylics. That was my art lesson. The only art lesson I've ever had in my entire life took place in the middle of an art store.
Ed had a great sense of humor. I can recall when we were sharing the studio down on 7th Street, and Ed walks up and he looks at my palette and he says, God, he said, that white looks good enough to eat. And he just scooped up all the white paint and put it in his mouth. And I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, oh my God. And he had come when I was in the bathroom or something and put some whipped cream on my palette. It just set me up perfectly.
I never heard that story. That's a great story.
Museo is one of only a few online museums, and also we're the only artist-endowed foundation in the United States to represent a Mexican-American artist. One of our possibilities in partnering with Autodesk to bring back Eduardo's whitewashed mural is that it will return the mural to a global audience, but also their pioneering innovation reflects Eduardo's place as a pioneering artist in the United States.